It was a night like no other, a night wrapped in an eerie silence that seemed to stretch far beyond the old, decaying villa on the outskirts of town. A place whispered about in hushed tones, its name only spoken by those with trembling lips, as if even the air around it carried an unspoken curse. For decades, the villa had stood abandoned, its once grand facade now crumbling under the weight of time. A shadow of its former self, it loomed like a predator watching over the helpless, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too close. The road to the villa was overgrown with wild vines and thorned bushes, the asphalt cracked and swallowed by nature's relentless embrace. Only one way to reach it remained, through the narrow, broken path that twisted around the property's fence, leading directly to the rusted gate, hanging off its hinges like the broken promise of safety. But even from the moment you set foot on that cursed ground, there was no turning back. Before the fear begins, hit like and subscribe, don't miss the chills. Tell us where you're watching from, and brace yourself for stories so terrifying, they'll haunt your night. Elliot Cole, a seasoned paranormal investigator known for his fearless pursuit of the supernatural, stood before the gate. The air felt heavier here, thick, suffocating. It pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. But this wasn't the first haunted place he'd investigated. In fact, it wasn't even the scariest. He'd faced darker entities, heard voices from beyond the grave, and seen things that most people couldn't even imagine. But something about the villa felt different. This was no ordinary haunt. This place was suffused with a malice so deep it felt alive, as if the villa itself was watching him. He'd heard the rumors. The stories of disappearances, of people who entered the villa and were never seen again. But Elliot was no superstitious fool. He was here for one reason only, to uncover the truth. What was it about this place that made it so notorious? Why had it remained empty for so long, yet still so alive? With a deep breath, Elliot pushed open the gate. The sound of it scraping against the rusted hinges was deafening in the oppressive silence. He took one step, then another, until the villa loomed just feet away, its broken windows staring back at him like the eyes of something ancient and hungry. The doors creaked open as if beckoning him inside, but as soon as he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. A cold wind rushed past him, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, old wood, mold, and something far worse, the unmistakable smell of death. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a violent force that made his heart skip a beat. He spun around, hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight at his side. The beam flickered, then steadied, revealing nothing but shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. And then he heard it. A low, almost imperceptible whisper. "Get out, now." His skin prickled as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. But it wasn't the whisper that made his blood run cold, it was the fact that it came from behind the closed door. The door he had just walked through. Elliot stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The door, once creaking and hesitant to open, now slammed shut with such finality that it felt as though the villa itself had swallowed him whole. His breath came out in shallow gasps as the oppressive silence returned, thick and suffocating. He reached for the flashlight at his side, his hands trembling just slightly, the cold creeping up his spine. With one deep breath, he gripped the handle and pointed the beam toward the entrance he'd just come through. But the door was no longer there. Instead, a blank, featureless wall now stood in its place, like the villa had melted away the moment he crossed the threshold. The walls seemed to pulse with something unseen, alive, perhaps, or breathing. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to step forward into the darkness of the entry hall, the air growing even colder as he passed the threshold. The moment he crossed, the floor beneath him groaned, alive, like a forgotten creature trying to awake from an eternal slumber. Dust fell from the rafters above, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with something sharp, metallic, like the scent of blood. Elliot shivered, but he wasn't about to let fear take hold. This was his job, after all. He'd been inside dozens of haunted places, some even darker than this, and yet, there was something here, something wrong. He ran the flashlight across the room, revealing the remnants of what once was a grand foyer. The wallpaper peeled away in chunks, the wood floor cracked and warped under the weight of time, and an ancient chandelier hung from the ceiling, its once beautiful crystals now shattered, their sharp edges glinting like eyes staring down at him. There were no signs of life, no animals, No rats scurrying to hide, nothing. The house seemed utterly still. As he stepped deeper into the room, Elliot's heart pounded, echoing in his chest. The faintest sound of something moving echoed in the distance, like a soft shuffle of feet. He turned quickly, shining the flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing. Just shadows. It wasn't uncommon for old buildings to play tricks on the mind, creaking beams, shifting wood, but Elliot had learned to trust his instincts. And something was here, watching. The door to his right opened on its own with a low, grinding noise, revealing what appeared to be an old sitting room. The furniture was covered in dusty, moth-eaten sheets, the curtains hanging limp, untouched by time but marked with an unmistakable darkness. His heart skipped again. That whisper. Get out, now. He turned, searching the room for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, no one. Just the relentless shadows, swallowing every corner of the house. Elliot took a step into the room, his feet dragging against the dust-covered floor, but a sudden thought froze him in his tracks. What was that? It was a figure in the corner of the room, a reflection, but not quite. He could swear there was something standing in the farthest corner, hidden just behind the veil of darkness. The air seemed to thicken there, pressing in on him. Was it a shadow? Or something worse? His breath hitched as he inched closer, his flashlight beam trembling as he cast it in the direction of the figure. The light flickered. Once. Twice. A third time. Then it was gone. He snapped the light to the wall, frantically searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. A feeling of unease crawled under his skin. Maybe it was just the dark playing tricks on his mind. But that feeling, the feeling of being watched, didn't fade. It grew. It swirled around him, drawing tighter and tighter, until it felt like the very walls were closing in. The whispering voice returned, louder this time, unmistakable. Clear. Get out, now. Elliot spun on his heel, his pulse racing. He wasn't alone. Who's there? He demanded, his voice barely louder than a whisper. But no answer came. Instead, the silence seemed to press down on him harder, suffocating. The room felt smaller, more claustrophobic with every passing second. He could hear his own heartbeat now, thumping in his ears, mixing with the overwhelming silence of the house. Then, out of the corner of his eye, the shadows moved. A shape, a faint outline of a person, appeared in the doorway of the room. It stood tall, its outline distorted, as if made from smoke, yet undeniably human. A woman. Her features were indistinguishable, her face hidden in the deep darkness, but he could feel her eyes on him. Her presence. Cold. Unyielding. Leave, before it's too late. Elliot's stomach lurched. The voice wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a command. He took a step back, but the room seemed to shift. The walls were closing in, the ceiling dropping lower, and with every second that passed, the air grew thicker. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, each step echoing louder. And then, like a snap, the lights went out. The beam of his flashlight died. The entire room was swallowed in darkness. Elliot's heart was still pounding in his chest as he stood in the darkness of the room, the beam of his flashlight weak and flickering, casting more shadows than light. The sudden silence in the villa was suffocating, almost as if it were holding its breath, waiting. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, it had to be. There was no way a house could be alive. And yet, every instinct he had screamed that something was terribly wrong here. His pulse echoed in his ears, and the cold air seemed to creep deeper under his skin. He forced himself to move, his feet dragging on the dust-covered floor as he cautiously made his way through the room. The soft thud of his boots was the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. The shadows seemed to move with him, always just a bit ahead, as if they were somehow aware of his every step. His skin prickled. There was something in the air, a feeling, an energy, something that wasn't right. Turning his attention back to the room, Elliot scanned the furniture covered in dusty white sheets, the remnants of a life long gone. An old, tarnished mirror hung on the wall in front of him, its surface cracked and distorted. But as he moved past it, something caught his eye. It wasn't his reflection, no, there was something, someone there. The image was fleeting, like a wisp of smoke, but he could swear he saw a figure standing behind him, just out of reach of the light. He spun around quickly, his breath catching in his throat, but there was nothing there. No shadow, no movement, nothing. "It's just the darkness," he whispered under his breath, trying to calm himself. "You've been in worse situations." But the air felt heavier now, as though the walls were closing in, and every step forward felt like a step deeper into something sinister. He reached for his backpack and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, his journal. Elliot had brought it to record everything, from his observations to any paranormal activities he might encounter. He flipped it open, jotting down notes quickly, almost mechanically. The atmosphere in the villa is oppressive. The temperature fluctuates rapidly. 1 minute, it's freezing cold, and the next, suffocatingly warm. Strange noises in the distance, shadows that seem to move with me. I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. Time seems warped here. As he wrote, he became aware of the faint sound of footsteps echoing softly in the hallway beyond the room. Thump, thump, thump. His pen stopped mid-sentence. His heart skipped a beat. The footsteps didn't stop. They were moving closer. Elliot's eyes darted to the door, which remained ajar, a sliver of darkness on the other side. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, grew louder with every passing second. His breath hitched in his chest as the sound stopped just outside the doorway, but the figure did not appear. He strained his ears, but no further sound came. Not even the creak of the old wooden floorboards that would have given away the presence of someone or something moving. The silence was unbearable. He decided to make his move, stepping carefully toward the doorway. With each step, the air grew colder, like a creeping frost brushing against his skin. His fingers tightened around the flashlight, and he hesitated before leaning out of the doorway. But there was no one there. A wave of confusion washed over him. The footsteps had definitely been real, he hadn't imagined them. But now, standing in the cold corridor with nothing but darkness around him, it was as if the house was playing with him, toying with his mind. He moved further down the hall, the beam of his flashlight illuminating faded portraits on the walls, their faces grim and cold, staring at him with lifeless eyes. The walls seemed to close in around him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, its very structure shifting, moving, as if it were aware of his presence. He reached a corner at the end of the hall, and that's when he saw it. A door, old and cracked, with what appeared to be a dark stain on the floor in front of it. The air around the door was thick, heavy, and charged. His pulse quickened as his eyes were drawn to it. There was a sense of foreboding that made his skin crawl. He slowly approached the door, each step slow, deliberate, like something in the room was watching his every movement. The shadows danced on the walls, their shapes twisting unnaturally. The door was slightly ajar, a cold draft seeping through the crack, making the hair on the back of his neck stand up. A warning flashed in his mind. Don't open it. But there was something in him that wouldn't let go. Something about that door called to him. The air around it seemed to hum with an invisible energy, pulling him toward it. He reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into his palm as he turned it slowly. As the door creaked open, he was hit by the overwhelming smell of decay, old wood, dust, and something rotten. The room inside was dark, save for a sliver of light from the hallway. He squinted into the darkness, but all he could see were dust-covered shelves, old furniture, and something that looked like a large wooden box in the far corner. Suddenly, a voice whispered in his ear, low and cold. "You shouldn't have come." The words were clear, too clear. Elliot froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice had come from right behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. But the hallway remained empty. The shadows stretched, twisting and shifting in the corners of his vision. Then, with a trembling hand, he shone the flashlight on the box in the corner. It was old, far older than anything in the villa. The wood was dark, stained, with strange markings carved into its surface, symbols that seemed to shift when he looked away, as if they were alive. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat, the urge to step back, but he fought it. This was why he was here. This was what he had come for. He approached the box slowly, each step bringing him closer to something ancient, something wrong. As he reached out to touch the lid, a gust of cold wind slammed the door behind him, causing him to jump back in shock. The flashlight flickered and died. A sudden rush of energy surged through him, a wave of darkness that swept over him, filling his mind with terrifying images. He saw glimpses of the villa's past, figures dressed in old, tattered clothes, faces contorted in pain. Blood. Screams. The walls of the villa seemed to bleed, as if the house itself was alive with the tortured souls of its past. The whispers grew louder, closing in on him, speaking words he could barely understand. Leave. It's too late. You're part of it now. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw a face, the woman, standing behind him in the shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and empty. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Then, all at once, everything went silent. The darkness closed in completely. Elliot stood frozen in the middle of the dark room, his heart pounding in his chest, each beat reverberating in his ears. The cold wind that had slammed the door shut behind him still whipped through the room, tugging at his clothes and causing goosebumps to rise on his skin. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention, a primal instinct telling him to run, to get out before whatever was lurking in the shadows could fully materialize. But his legs refused to move. The whispers, the voices, continued to echo through his mind, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. Leave, leave now. They were not just words, they were a command. The sensation of being watched grew unbearable, as if every inch of the room, every corner, every crack in the walls, held eyes that were watching his every move. With a shaking hand, Elliot reached for his flashlight, the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. The beam flickered, casting distorted shadows on the walls. His grip tightened as he tried to steady it, but the light was no longer working the way it should. The shadows around him seemed to bend, twisting in ways that defied logic, creeping into the light as if alive, moving, pulsating. He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He had to push forward. This was what he was here for. The villa was hiding something deep within its crumbling walls. Something that had been buried for years, maybe centuries. He had come for the truth, no matter how terrifying. Taking cautious steps, Elliot moved towards the wooden box in the corner, his eyes never leaving the swirling shadows. He reached for it once again, this time feeling a distinct unease settle in his gut. The symbols on the box seemed to pulse, alive, moving just under his fingertips. He ran his fingers over the markings, tracing the intricate lines, but just as his hand brushed over the last symbol, a sudden crash echoed through the room. The sound was so violent, so real, it shook him to his core. Elliot whirled around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing. Nothing at all. The room was as still as death. His breath came in quick, shallow bursts as he tried to calm his racing heart. Was it just the house settling? A burst of nerves? Or was there something else in the shadows, just beyond his sight? It's just your mind, he muttered to himself, trying to reason with the fear that was slowly creeping into every fiber of his being. There's nothing here. But the floor groaned beneath him as if answering his thoughts, and the room grew colder, the temperature plummeting so suddenly that his breath became visible, white and misty, like he was standing in the middle of a frozen wasteland. And then, the door, the one he had entered through, slammed open again. Hard. It banged against the wall with a force that rattled the entire building. His heart skipped a beat. The door should have been shut. He had closed it when he first entered this cursed room. But now, it was open, swinging wide, and it was as if the villa itself had decided to invite him deeper into its heart. A heart that beat with the rhythm of something ancient, something dark. A whisper, cold and deep, slid into his ear. ***, don't look back. But he couldn't help it. His eyes were drawn to the doorway, to the long, dark corridor that stretched out before him like a mouth ready to swallow him whole. For a split second, Elliot thought he saw something move, just a flicker at the edge of his vision. But when he turned, nothing was there. Nothing at all. The hallway was empty, silent, and shrouded in shadows that seemed to draw closer with every passing moment. Was it his mind playing tricks? Or had he truly seen something, someone, in the darkness? Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped even further, and a sharp, acrid odor filled the room like something rotten, decaying. Elliot's stomach churned, and he fought the urge to gag. The smell was nauseating, overwhelming, and it felt like it was coming from all directions. He turned to the open door, the one leading deeper into the house. There was only one choice. He could leave. Run. Get out and never return. The voices were growing louder now, urging him to go, to escape before it was too late. But a part of him, curiosity, stubbornness, or perhaps the lure of something far darker, compelled him to take a step forward. His flashlight flickered again, its beam cutting through the darkness like a weak thread of light. He stepped into the hall, his feet heavy on the creaky floorboards, and immediately the temperature dropped even further. The air was suffocating now, thick with the smell of rot, the feeling of something watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. As he moved down the hallway, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence, the house began to feel alive, breathing, shifting with each passing moment. The walls seemed to close in around him, as if the house itself was alive and aware of his every step. He could feel the oppressive weight of history pressing in on him, pushing him toward whatever lay ahead. The footsteps were back, louder this time, closer, as if they were right behind him. Elliot spun around, heart racing, but again, there was nothing. No one. The shadows were darker here, more oppressive. He took a few more steps, the air around him growing thicker with each one. And then, he saw it. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the gloom, was a door. It wasn't like the others. This one was different, older, darker, and it seemed to hum with energy, a kind of oppressive force that made his pulse race. The door had an aura, a presence that felt almost alive. There was no turning back now. Whatever was behind that door, whatever the villa was hiding, he was about to find out. He moved toward it, his hand shaking as he reached for the doorknob, a sense of dread filling him. Something in the air crackled, like static electricity. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. Leave. It's too late. Don't open the door. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't not open it. He had to know. He turned the knob. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing the unknown darkness beyond. Elliot's heart was in his throat, the oppressive air thick with the smell of damp wood and rot. He stepped forward, the flashlight trembling in his grip. It felt as though the entire house was watching him, waiting for him to take this next step. The whispers were louder now, almost a chant, turn back. Leave this place. But his hand, moving of its own accord, tightened on the doorknob, and with a final push, the door creaked open wider. Inside was a small room, too small, too confined. The walls were lined with cracked and peeling wallpaper, once elegant, but now faded and stained with the marks of time. The floorboards groaned under his feet, their creases and gaps gaping like open wounds. The air was stale, but there was something else, a faint scent of decay that lingered in the corners of the room. The windows were covered in layers of grime, the glass cracked and fogged, allowing no hint of daylight to pierce the room. Elliot stepped further inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the heavy darkness, casting long shadows against the walls. His eyes scanned the room, but there was nothing remarkable about it, nothing, except for one thing. In the far corner, against the wall, sat a small, old rocking chair. Its wood was cracked and splintered, the fabric torn, revealing a dark stain on the seat. The chair rocked slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if moved by a breeze, but there was no wind here. The air was still, suffocatingly still. Elliot took another step forward, his breathing shallow. The chair's gentle movement seemed to mock him, beckoning him toward it. He tried to shake the feeling that it was more than just a piece of furniture. There was something wrong about it. Something unsettling. As he approached, he noticed something else on the floor. Near the chair was a faded photograph. It was half buried under a layer of dust, the edges curled and yellowed with age. Without thinking, Elliot bent down and picked it up, his fingers trembling as he brushed away the dust. The photo was old, black and white, a family portrait, a man, a woman, and two children, smiling, their eyes bright, their faces almost too perfect. But something was off. Elliot's stomach turned as he stared at the photograph. There was something wrong about the smiles. The eyes empty, hollow. The family appeared happy, yet there was a heaviness to the image. A darkness that seemed to seep through the cracks of the frame, seeping into his mind like a poison. He blinked, and the image shifted. For a moment, it was as though the faces in the photograph were moving, changing. The smiles twisted into something grotesque, and the eyes, those hollow eyes, were now staring back at him. His breath caught in his throat. The room around him seemed to close in, the shadows stretching, bending, as if the walls were alive, reaching for him. He stumbled backward, his hand gripping the wall for support. He shook his head, trying to clear the dizziness, trying to pull himself back from the edge of insanity. It was just a trick of the light. Just the house messing with his mind. But even as he thought it, he could still feel the cold grip of something unnatural tightening around him. He was not alone. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, more urgent. "You shouldn't have touched it." His head snapped to the side, but again, there was nothing. No one. The room was empty. He turned back to the photograph, but it was no longer in his hand. It had vanished. A chill swept over him, as though the temperature had dropped by degrees. His pulse quickened, and he felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. Something was wrong. Something had just crossed a line. Before he could react, there was a faint, distant sound, a creak. Then another. And another. The sound was coming from the far side of the room. His flashlight flickered, and the beam danced nervously across the walls. The air around him thickened, and he realized the room had become colder, much colder, almost freezing. And then he saw it. A door, hidden in the far corner of the room, barely visible behind a thick veil of dust and shadows. It was small, almost hidden from view, as if the house didn't want it to be found. But Elliot saw it, and something within him told him it was important. Something told him that whatever was beyond that door was the key to everything. Without thinking, he moved toward it, his footsteps slow, deliberate, his heart thundering in his chest. The air around him was growing heavier, suffocating. As he neared the door, the creaking noises returned, but this time, they were closer. They weren't coming from the room anymore. They were coming from the door itself. Elliot reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the cold, weathered wood. He didn't know why, but he felt an overwhelming compulsion to open it. To see what lay beyond. With a deep breath, he turned the knob. It was stiff, resisting his touch, but with a final twist, the door creaked open, revealing only darkness. The flashlight beam cut through it, but the light was swallowed whole, as though the shadows themselves were alive, feeding on it. Elliot took another step forward, then another, his mind racing. Was he really about to do this? Was he about to step into the heart of whatever haunted this place? A gust of cold wind slammed into him, pushing him backward. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, as if something was warning him not to continue. The room went completely still. The whispers stopped. Everything was silent, too silent. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the rocking chair began to move again. This time, it moved faster, more violently. The creaking grew louder, more frantic, and Elliot's blood ran cold. He knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't alone in this room anymore. The chair rocked back and forth, its wooden legs scraping across the floor, as if something or someone was sitting in it. A low, guttural laugh, so cold, so empty, rang out, reverberating through the room. Elliot's heart stopped. His eyes locked onto the chair, his breath catching in his throat. The air was thick with an oppressive presence, one that was as old as the house itself. And then, a voice, clear and chilling, whispered through the room. "You shouldn't have come. Now, you will never leave." Elliot stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The air around him had thickened to a suffocating weight, the shadows in the room stretching and warping as if they were alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The rocking chair continued its rhythmic motion, each creak growing louder, more forceful, like a heartbeat in the dark. The voice, the cold, guttural laugh, still echoed in his mind. It wasn't just in the room, it was inside him now, reverberating through his thoughts, drowning out all rational thought. "You shouldn't have come. Now, you will never leave." He wanted to run. He wanted to get out of this cursed place, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, as though the house itself had planted him here, refusing to let him leave. His flashlight flickered again, the beam struggling against the overwhelming darkness that seemed to bleed from the walls. The room was growing colder by the second, the temperature dropping so rapidly that his breath became visible in the air, swirling around him like a cloud of ice. The whispers were back, this time louder, more frantic. The voices of the past, trapped in this house, calling to him, pulling him in. Leave. Leave now. It's too late. But Elliot couldn't move. His gaze was locked on the rocking chair, now moving faster, its violent motion making a sharp screeching noise as it scraped against the wooden floor. He could almost hear something, or someone, sitting in it, its weight shifting, its presence growing heavier with each passing second. He stepped forward, against his better judgment, drawn toward it as if by an invisible force. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the house, a steady pulse that seemed to be growing in intensity. The rocking chair's movements grew erratic, and suddenly, it stopped. Completely. The silence was deafening. For a long moment, the room stood still, as if holding its breath. Then, a noise, a faint scraping sound, came from the corner of the room. Elliot's eyes snapped to the source, and there it was again, the photograph. It had returned, lying face up on the floor where he had dropped it earlier. But this time, the faces in the photo were not the same. They were twisted, their features distorted. The smiles were gone, replaced by wide, hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at him, pleading. "Why are you here?" The voice in his head was softer now, almost a whisper, but it was no less chilling. It wasn't the voice of the house. No. This voice came from somewhere deeper, darker. The figure in the photograph, the one he thought was a family, now appeared as something else entirely. It was watching him, silently accusing him of trespassing. His heart pounded harder, and a cold sweat slicked his skin. He forced himself to look away, but the room had changed. The walls seemed to be closing in, the very air around him thick with the stench of decay, of death. He felt dizzy, disoriented, as though the room itself was shifting, warping into something otherworldly. Suddenly, a loud bang sounded from behind him, coming from the door he had just opened. Elliot spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark, illuminating the doorway. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move, something tall and unnatural, standing just beyond the threshold, out of reach of the light. He took a cautious step toward the door, his pulse racing, every instinct screaming at him to get out. But before he could take another step, the air around him cracked with energy, and a voice, deep and full of malice, boomed in the darkness. "You're not leaving. Not yet." The force of the words hit him like a physical blow, sending him stumbling backward into the room. His flashlight flickered wildly, casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch out toward him, reaching for him with ghostly fingers. The rocking chair started moving again, this time with a fierce intensity. It didn't just rock, it jerked, as if something was trying to break free from it. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as he saw something, a figure, appear in the chair, cloaked in shadow, its features indistinguishable but undeniably human. It was there. The room suddenly shifted, the walls seemed to collapse inward, and the air grew thicker, colder. Elliot felt as though the very foundation of the house was trembling beneath him, as if it was on the brink of collapse, struggling to hold its secrets within. And then, the figure in the rocking chair moved. It was slow at first, a subtle motion that seemed to defy gravity. The figure stood up, its limbs unnatural, elongated. As it rose, the shadows around it seemed to distort and bend, coiling around its form like tendrils. The flashlight beam landed on its face. The sight was enough to freeze his blood. It was a man, but not human. His face was stretched, contorted, his skin grey and mottled, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at Elliot with an intensity that made his stomach churn. His mouth hung open in a grotesque expression, as if frozen in a scream. The man's body was decayed, half-rotten, the flesh clinging to his bones like a death mask. Elliot's legs buckled beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the cold radiating off the figure, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to cut through his very soul. The man didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. "You were warned." The words came not from the man's mouth, but from the air itself, a whisper that echoed through the room, vibrating through his body, shaking him to his core. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, the very essence of the villa twisting and shifting, like it was alive and fighting against him. In the distance, he could hear faint voices, screams, maybe. Or were they cries for help? Desperate, haunting cries that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The villa was alive. The souls trapped within it were angry, vengeful, and they wanted him to join them. Suddenly, the rocking chair stopped. The figure in front of him straightened, its empty eyes never leaving his. And in that moment, Elliot knew with terrifying certainty that he had uncovered something much darker than he could have imagined. He had entered the heart of this evil place, and now, there was no way out. The voice, deep and hollow, sounded again, this time directly in his ear. "You can never leave." The chill in the room was unbearable. Elliot could feel it, creeping into his bones, turning his skin to ice. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the figure, its face grotesquely twisted, its eyes wide and empty, towered before him, silent but suffocating. He couldn't look away. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to flee, but his legs were like stone, frozen in place by fear, by the dark force that filled the room. The figure didn't move, not at first. It simply stood there, staring at him with those empty, soulless eyes, as though weighing him, measuring his worth. Its decayed skin hung from its bones like tattered cloth, every step it took, every creak of the floor beneath it, a reminder of the death it had endured and now was forcing Elliot to endure as well. The whispers in the air grew louder, more frantic, as though the very house itself was aware of what was unfolding. "It's not too late. You can still leave." Elliot's mind spun. His breath came in shallow gasps, as though the room was choking the air out of him. He wanted to speak, to shout, to tell this thing, this soul, to leave him alone. But the words caught in his throat, a paralyzing fear gripping his voice. The thing in front of him moved, its body jerking slightly as though the shadows themselves were pulling at it. Its hands reached out toward him, and Elliot stumbled backward, almost tripping over his own feet. The air grew heavier still, thick with a presence, an energy that felt like it was suffocating him. The figure's mouth opened. At first, it was a slow movement, as though it were savoring the sound that would come next. Elliot could see its jagged teeth, stained with what looked like dried blood. When it spoke, the voice was low, almost a whisper, but it echoed through Elliot's head as if it were inside his mind. "You think you can leave, but you've already crossed the threshold." The room seemed to close in on him. The walls, once stable, were now pressing inward, their old timbers creaking as if they too were alive, angry and restless. The shadows grew darker, swallowing the meager light from his flashlight. For a moment, Elliot couldn't see anything but the pure blackness, like being submerged in ink. Then, a jarring sound broke through the silence, a door creaking open. Elliot's eyes snapped toward the source, his pulse quickening. There, in the far corner of the room, where there had been no door before, now stood a large, heavy wooden door, its surface weathered and scarred by time. The edges of the door were lined with dust, the dark wood almost glowing with an unnatural sheen. It wasn't there before. He could hear something coming from the other side of the door, a soft, low sound at first, barely audible. But it was growing louder. It was a sound like scratching, like something trying to break through the other side. And then, a voice. "Help! Help me!" Elliot's breath caught in his throat as his hand instinctively reached out for the door. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to know what was behind it. But something inside him urged him forward. Curiosity. Fear. Desperation. The figure, still watching, didn't move as Elliot took a tentative step toward the door. The shadows seemed to bend and twist around him, almost pulling him backward, but he pressed on, one foot in front of the other. When he reached the door, his fingers brushed against the rough wood. It was cold, colder than anything he had felt in the house before. He turned the knob slowly, his breath shaky, his eyes darting back to the figure, which had not moved. It was still standing in the middle of the room, watching him with those lifeless eyes. With a final twist, the door creaked open, revealing pitch-black darkness. Elliot could feel the air shift as soon as the door was open, thick, suffocating, like something was trying to escape. His pulse raced as his hand shook, the light from his flashlight trembling in the dark. Then he heard it. A soft rustling sound came from the dark, followed by a whisper so faint, it was almost lost in the room. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was weak, barely a breath, yet the words felt like a weight pressing down on him. Something was moving inside the darkness, a shadow, a form, barely visible. But it was alive, and it was trying to reach him. Elliot stepped into the darkness, his heart racing as he moved deeper into the unknown. The light from his flashlight barely reached past his hand, and the suffocating darkness seemed to absorb the beam entirely. Then, a figure emerged. A man, pale, gaunt, his skin drawn tight over his bones. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. His hands reached toward Elliot, fingers curling in desperation, as if begging for something, anything. "Help me, please." Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. This man, this shadowed figure, looked familiar. He couldn't place it at first, but there was something hauntingly familiar about his face. The eyes, the lips, the contorted, agonized expression. And then it hit him. It was the man from the photograph, the one who had disappeared from the picture. The one who had once smiled that perfect, false smile. But now, in the darkness, there was no smile. Only desperation. Fear. "Please, you have to help me." The words were like a drowning man's plea, an echo of a life lost. But before Elliot could react, the man's hands shot forward with unnatural speed. He grabbed Elliot's wrist, pulling him into the darkness, his touch ice-cold and unyielding. For a moment, Elliot thought he would be swallowed by the shadows, pulled into the same fate as the man, lost forever in the depths of the villa. But then, just as quickly, the man's grip loosened, and the figure collapsed to the floor with a final, rasping breath. Elliot gasped, stumbling backward, his heart hammering in his chest. The air in the room seemed to shift again, the oppressive weight lifting, but only slightly. The man was gone, vanished into the darkness. Elliot's mind was spinning. He tried to process what had just happened, but the answers were slipping further away. All he knew was that he had to get out, that he had uncovered something far worse than he had ever imagined. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, holding souls that were desperate to be freed. And somewhere within its walls, there was a secret, a truth so dark that it had trapped these souls here for eternity. He turned toward the door, but as he stepped back, something caught his eye. There, on the floor, near the threshold, was a small, faded journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. Hesitantly, Elliot reached for it, the unease crawling up his spine. As he opened the journal, a single page fell out. It was old, torn at the edges, and written in frenzied, shaky handwriting. The words were barely legible, but he could make out the chilling message. "They are watching. The house is alive. It will never let you leave." Elliot's hands trembled as he held the journal, his fingers brushing against the brittle pages. The words on the torn sheet had shaken him to his core. "They are watching. The house is alive. It will never let you leave." He had hoped, prayed, that his curiosity hadn't led him to this point. He had hoped that whatever he uncovered, it wouldn't be the truth. But now, in the thick of the villa's suffocating grip, he couldn't deny it any longer. This house, this cursed, forsaken place, was not like any other. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the walls, every cold gust of wind, they were all a part of something greater. Something far darker. Elliot had crossed a line he couldn't undo. And now, the house was waiting for him to realize the full extent of its power. As he continued to flip through the journal, the scrawled words grew more frantic, more desperate. Each page was filled with a man's descent into madness, as if he, too, had learned the house's terrible secret. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, a reflection of the terror that had overtaken its writer. One entry stood out, a few pages in. "There is no escape. Every door you open only leads to another room, and every room only brings you closer to the heart of the house. It is alive. It knows you. It watches you. And when you find the heart, there is no return." Elliot's heart raced. His breath came in ragged gasps as he read the words, his mind screaming for a way out. But the truth had already sunk in, the villa had trapped him. The ground beneath him groaned ominously, as though the house itself was aware of his every movement. He stood, the journal falling from his hands as his eyes darted around the room. He had to keep moving. He had to get out. But where? A sudden clicking noise echoed from the hallway, distant but distinct. Elliot froze. His mind raced, wondering if it was the sound of the door he had opened earlier, the one that had appeared out of nowhere. The door that led to whatever thing had been hiding behind it. The man. The shadow. But the clicking didn't stop. It was growing louder. Closer. And then, to his horror, he recognized the sound. Footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking toward him. Panic surged in his chest as he moved instinctively toward the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer still. Whoever, or whatever, was coming for him was fast. Too fast. Elliot's mind was spinning. The flashlight in his hand flickered as though the very power was failing him, and he stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the journal that had fallen to the floor. His breath quickened as he scanned the room. What was that noise? The footsteps now sounded like they were directly outside the door. But there was no way anyone could be out there, not in this dark, desolate house. Then, the door creaked open slowly, as if nudged by an invisible hand. Elliot froze. A figure stood in the doorway. At first, he couldn't make out who or what it was. The light from his flashlight trembled, casting uneven shadows across the figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its outline barely visible in the darkness. And then, it stepped into the light. It was the man. The one from the photo. The one whose face had twisted in agony as the villa claimed him. His once vibrant face was now a hollow mask, stretched beyond recognition. His eyes were wide, but they were no longer human, just empty sockets, like black holes, staring at Elliot with an unsettling intensity. His mouth hung open, but no sound came from him. He was an empty shell, a puppet of the house. Elliot's chest tightened as the figure took a step forward, its movements stiff, jerky, as though it wasn't entirely in control of itself. The air grew colder still. The temperature in the room plummeted. He could see his breath now, hanging in the air in a cloud of frost. The man's head tilted slightly, and then it spoke. But it wasn't his voice. It was something darker, deeper, almost inhuman. "You've come too far." The words rang out, thick with malice. The man's lips barely moved, but the voice boomed in Elliot's mind as if it were coming from everywhere, the very walls closing in with each word. "You should have turned back when you had the chance. Now you will join us. Forever." Elliot stumbled back, his heart racing. No. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't be trapped like this. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice breaking the unnatural silence. His own words sounded strange in the vast emptiness of the villa, like they didn't belong. The figure remained silent, its hollow gaze locked onto Elliot. The air around them thickened, a palpable, suffocating presence that made his chest tighten, his breath catch. And then, a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within the man's chest. The man took another step forward, and Elliot could feel it, the pressure building, like the walls themselves were closing in. His heart was thumping so loudly in his ears that he couldn't think, couldn't hear anything else. Every instinct screamed at him to run. Without thinking, Elliot turned and bolted for the exit. His legs burned as he ran, his flashlight barely lighting the path ahead of him. He could hear the footsteps behind him, quick, heavy, closing in on him. The house was hunting him now. As he reached the front door, his hand grasped the cold handle, but before he could open it, the door slammed shut on its own. He yanked at it with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the figure was getting closer, its footsteps steady and unrelenting. The air in the house was thick, and the suffocating presence of the villa was closing in, pushing him to the edge of panic. Elliot turned, desperation rising in his chest. He had to escape. But as he looked up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man, the tortured soul, was standing right behind him. His cold, empty eyes locked onto Elliot's, and he whispered once more, his voice like the creaking of old wood. "It's too late to leave now." The figure reached out with skeletal hands, its fingers curled into claws, and in that moment, Elliot felt the chilling truth. The villa had claimed him. There would be no escape. The figure closed in. Elliot's chest heaved with each frantic breath as he stumbled back into the darkness of the villa. The once vibrant energy of the house had been replaced with an oppressive weight that seemed to follow him every step he took. The walls felt alive, breathing, watching, tightening around him. Every time his eyes flicked toward a shadow, he felt it move, as though the house itself was hunting him. He could still hear the man's voice, low and chilling, echoing in his head. "It's too late to leave now." The words had felt like a curse, sealing his fate. There was no escaping the house. He could feel it in every creak, every groan of the floor beneath him. The heart of the villa was closing in on him, and the closer he got, the stronger its hold became. His feet faltered, his mind clouded with panic. He couldn't think straight. Every door, every window he tried, was locked or vanished, and the more he fought to break free, the more the house pressed in, tightening its grip. "There has to be a way out," Elliot muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper against the suffocating silence. But no answer came. Suddenly, there was a sound. A familiar sound, but one that was no longer welcome. The footsteps. They were back. Elliot spun around, but the hall behind him was empty. Just shadows and the heavy air. The footsteps, though, kept coming. And this time, they were closer, much closer. He backed away from the noise, but then, a whisper, sharp and distinct, cut through the air like a blade. "Follow the path. You must follow the path." Elliot froze. The voice, it wasn't just in his head this time. It was coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the house. The words seemed to pull at his mind, urging him forward. The path. What path? Suddenly, the floor beneath him cracked open, the wooden boards splintering as if something beneath the house was reaching out to grab him. A deep, rumbling growl followed, vibrating the walls, shaking the very air around him. He wasn't alone. His instincts screamed for him to run, but before he could react, the floor beneath him gave way completely. The ground fell out from under him. Elliot tumbled into the darkness below. The world went black. When Elliot's senses returned, he found himself lying on cold stone, the air thick with the stench of decay and rotting wood. His head throbbed, and his body ached from the fall. He could hear the sound of dripping water somewhere nearby, a slow, rhythmic patter that only added to the suffocating silence. He pushed himself up, his hands scraping against the rough stone floor. The light from his flashlight barely pierced the pitch-black darkness surrounding him. The walls were covered in mildew, the air thick with damp and mold. There was something about this place, this chamber, that made him feel even more trapped, more suffocated than before. The house's grip on him was growing tighter, more suffocating with every passing second. But this time, there was something else, something far worse. A hum. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, resonating in his chest, vibrating through his bones. The sound was unnatural, otherworldly. The heart of the villa was calling to him, drawing him closer. He turned in the direction of the noise and saw it. At the far end of the room was a door, almost completely hidden by shadows, its surface cracked and worn. But the hum, it was coming from beyond it. This was where the path led him. He had no choice. Elliot slowly made his way toward the door, the hum growing louder, more desperate. With each step, he could feel the house's pulse, its living, breathing heart that beat with every footfall. The very air was thick with dark energy, as though the house itself was watching him, waiting for him to reach its core. As he stepped through the door, he was hit with a wave of cold air. The room inside was even darker than the hallway, a near impenetrable blackness. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure. It was standing in the center of the room, bathed in shadow. Its outline was barely visible, but there was no mistaking the presence. It was watching him. Elliot's pulse quickened. He could feel it now, the force of the house itself, surrounding him, pushing against him. There was nowhere left to run. No place to hide. The heart of the villa was alive. And it wanted him. The air in the room grew even colder as Elliot stood frozen, his breath forming clouds of frost in the thick darkness. The figure in front of him, tall, foreboding, and obscured by the shadows, seemed to be waiting. Watching. Its presence was suffocating, more oppressive than anything he had felt so far. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to turn and flee, but his legs were rooted to the spot. The hum from the heart of the house vibrated deep in his chest, its pulse in sync with the quickened beat of his heart. "Who are you?" Elliot asked, his voice a shaky whisper, barely able to pierce the heavy silence that hung between them. The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. The air seemed to shift, a cold, tangible weight settling over him. The room was alive in a way he could no longer deny. The shadows twisted and stretched, forming dark tendrils that reached for him, as though they were alive, searching, pulling him closer to the figure in the center. Then, as though the house itself had decided to answer his question, the figure stepped forward, and the darkness receded just enough for Elliot to see the shape more clearly. It was no longer just a man. The figure was contorted, its body unnaturally long and twisted, the skin stretched over its bones like a living canvas of horrors. Its arms were too long, its hands clawed, like some grotesque version of a human. The face was the most terrifying part, empty eyes, hollow and dark, staring through him, into him. Its mouth hung open in a permanent, grotesque grin, sharp teeth jutting out, slick with something dark that glistened in the dim light. Elliot took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure's lips parted slightly, and a low, guttural voice came through, raspy, as though it were dragging itself from the depths of a tomb. "I am the house," the voice rumbled, the words vibrating in the air, each syllable seeming to shake the very walls around him. "I am the keeper of the lost, the devourer of souls. You are mine now." The words settled over him like a curse, cold and suffocating. Elliot's pulse thundered in his ears, his mind racing. The house was alive. It wasn't just haunted, it was the source of the evil. It had always been watching, always been waiting for someone to come too far, someone like him. And now, it had him. A strange sensation surged through him, something akin to dread, but more, something deeper, as if the house was pulling at his soul. It wasn't just physical fear anymore. It was like the house was inside him, crawling beneath his skin, pressing against his mind. Suddenly, a series of sharp, high-pitched shrieks echoed through the room, cutting through the thick, suffocating silence. Elliot staggered, his ears ringing, as the walls seemed to pulse with the sound, each cry more desperate than the last. It was coming from all directions, from within the walls, the floors, even from the air itself. The shrieks seemed to rise and fall in time with the pulsating hum of the villa's heart. He could feel the heat, unnatural warmth, begin to radiate from the heart of the house, as though something was feeding, growing, strengthening. The very ground beneath him seemed to tremble in response, as though it, too, was alive, shifting with every beat of the heart. "You are here to feed the hunger," the figure continued, its voice now layered with multiple, hissing tones, as though the house itself had several voices, all speaking through it. "And when you feed me, you become a part of me. Forever." Elliot's legs gave way, his mind spinning. This was it. There was no escaping now. The house had him. It had always been waiting for him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. His eyes fell to the floor, where the stones were shifting, moving beneath him like a living organism, grinding against each other with a creaking sound. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his bones. And then, the ground split open, a crack running across the floor from the figure toward Elliot's feet. No. He had to move. He had to escape. But his body was paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer weight of the house's power. Every step forward felt impossible, as though the very air was heavy, dragging him back, pushing him into the heart of the darkness. The shrieks grew louder, more frantic, as though they were calling to him, begging him to join them. He looked up, trying to find an exit, trying to see any way out, but the room was closing in on him. The heart of the villa was pulling him in, suffocating him with its grip. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, the whispers came again. This time, they were different. "You have a choice," the voice murmured, soft and serpentine, just behind his ear. "You can feed me, and you will become part of me. Or..." Elliot's heart skipped a beat as the figure moved closer, its elongated, skeletal hand reaching for him. "Or you can break the cycle. You can end it all. If you have the courage." End it all? Elliot's mind raced. He had to find a way to escape, to break free from this nightmare, from this living prison. The figure's hand hovered just inches from his face, its icy fingers twitching as if ready to grasp him. The air was thick with a suffocating presence. But how? The voice was still echoing in his mind, urging him, the choice is yours. Break the heart. Destroy it. End the hunger. Elliot's fingers twitched involuntarily as the hum grew louder, vibrating in his chest, pulling him closer to the center of the room, to the heart of the villa. His mind screamed for him to fight back, to do something, anything to stop this madness. The figure's eyes, those empty, hollow pits, stared at him, no longer with malice but with something else. Was it fear? Regret? The figure's voice broke through his thoughts once more, this time softer, quieter. End it. Or be lost, forever. Elliot's mind was a chaotic whirl of fear, confusion, and desperation. The house had him cornered, its power suffocating him with every passing second. The figure, the embodiment of the house itself, stood before him, its eyes hollow, its claws outstretched, offering him a terrible choice. End it, or become one with me, the voice echoed once again, a chilling whisper that seemed to swirl around him, pressing in from all sides. The room trembled, the walls pulsating like a living heart, each beat vibrating in his chest. You must make your choice, now. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. His body felt heavy, as though the very air was dragging him down, crushing him. His legs threatened to buckle under the weight of it all, but he couldn't move. His mind screamed for him to act, to do something, anything, but everything around him seemed to be pulling him deeper into the house's clutches. He looked at the figure before him, the man who had once lived here, now twisted into something other, something terrifying. The same face that had stared back at him from the journal. Was this the fate he was doomed to? Was he destined to become like the others, a hollow shell of a person, consumed by the villa's insatiable hunger? The figure's eyes glinted with something like amusement, or perhaps mockery. You can fight me, little one. But you will never escape. No one ever does. The words were like poison, dripping with finality. Elliot could feel the truth of them in his bones, the crushing certainty of the house's power, the weight of its endless hunger. But somewhere deep inside him, a spark of defiance burned. No. He couldn't give in. He couldn't let this nightmare consume him like it had consumed so many before him. His hands clenched into fists, nails digging into his palms as he fought against the suffocating grip of the house. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop this. As the figure stepped closer, Elliot felt the pressure of the villa's force grow stronger. The air thickened. The hum of the heart grew louder. But then, something caught his eye. Across the room, a crack in the wall, barely noticeable, but enough for him to see. The faintest light filtered through the gap. For a fleeting moment, Elliot thought he saw something glimmering, something not of this world. The heart of the villa. That was it. The heart. The source of the villa's life, its terrible power. You cannot stop it, the figure taunted, its voice dripping with an eerie confidence. The heart is mine. You cannot break it. You cannot escape. Elliot's pulse quickened. The figure was right, he couldn't just leave. The house wouldn't let him. But perhaps there was another way. The heart, that was the key. The voice inside his mind urged him on, a deep, primal instinct urging him to act. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was the only chance he had. His eyes locked onto the figure, the terrible, twisted mockery of the man who had once lived here. You've already lost, the figure whispered again, its voice filled with dark amusement. It took another step forward, its elongated fingers reaching for him, but Elliot didn't flinch. He couldn't. He wasn't going to let this thing, this house, win. With a final surge of strength, Elliot turned and ran, his body moving on pure instinct. He darted across the room, avoiding the tendrils of darkness that lashed out at him. His heart hammered in his chest as he reached the crack in the wall. The light from the other side was dim, but it was enough. Enough to push him forward. No. The voice of the figure rose in fury behind him, but Elliot didn't look back. He was too close now. With all the strength he could muster, Elliot reached forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the crack. And then, he pulled. The wall shifted. The stone groaned as if in protest, but it gave way. The light from the other side grew brighter, more intense. Elliot didn't hesitate. He stepped through the gap, his heart racing. And then, the world tilted. The walls around him cracked open in every direction. The entire house seemed to shudder, as though something deep inside it was finally awakening. A deafening roar echoed through the villa, its power slamming into Elliot like a physical force. And then it stopped. The silence was overwhelming. The air, once thick with the villa's oppressive presence, seemed to clear. The hum, the vibrations, the oppressive darkness, they all vanished in an instant. Elliot stood in the middle of what could only be described as a void. The villa, the rooms, the corridors, everything was gone. All that was left was a dark, endless space that stretched in every direction, empty and still. For a moment, he thought he had died, that the house had consumed him and taken him to some dark realm beyond. But then, slowly, his senses returned. The pressure in the air was gone. The oppressive weight that had crushed him for so long was no more. And there, floating in the space around him, was the faintest glimmer of light, faint, but real. He had done it. The heart was gone. The villa's power, its terrifying grip, had been shattered. And with it, the house itself had crumbled away, leaving only nothingness. But even as he stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, something nagged at him. The figure's words echoed in his mind. You cannot escape. No one ever does. The thought lingered, cold and unnerving. Had he truly won? Or had he merely replaced one prison for another? But for now, in this moment of silence, Elliot didn't care. He had escaped. He had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.